Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is David P. Weber, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Oregon School of Law and the faculty director of our sports law program. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's Oregon Law Perspectives webinar. The Oregon Law Perspectives webinar series features distinguished Oregon law faculty and industry experts speaking on important and timely issues impacting law and society today. Joining me this afternoon are three panelists, all experts in the legal and practical hurdles of hosting a World Cup. Emily Jackson is the Deputy General Counsel and Director of Legal US with FIFA World Cup 2026. Tiffany Shepard is the Director and Senior Counsel of Brand Rights and Protection with FIFA World Cup 2026. And John Wilson is a partner at K&L Gates who worked collaboratively with FIFA to help Seattle earn host city status. Our panelists' collective education and professional backgrounds are both extensive and impressive. For the sake of time today, please visit the Oregon Law Perspectives page on the Oregon Law website for our panelists' complete bios. The plan for today is to cover several topics with our expert panelists weighing in and answering questions presented to them by me, your moderator. We'll discuss some general questions around hosting a World Cup, and then we will move on to important considerations related to brand protection, marketing partnerships, and other IP concerns, such as sponsorship rights and ambush marketing. We will also dig into the legal and practical hurdles faced by host countries and host cities when putting on the World Cup. If you have a question, please feel free to use the Q&A feature on the bottom of the Zoom toolbar. Only the panelists and I can see your questions, and they can be anonymous if you so choose. Depending on time, we may be able to answer a few of them at the end of this webinar. For those seeking CLE credit, you will receive an email after the event requesting your bar number so that we can report your attendance to the Oregon State Bar. This webinar is being recorded and will be published on the Oregon Law Perspectives page of the Oregon Law website. We'll also include a link to the recording in the email with CLE instructions. Now, please join me in welcoming our panelists, and let's begin. Okay, you all, thank you for being with us today. To start with a more general question at a 10,000-foot level, what makes hosting a global sporting event like the World Cup legally unique compared to other major events? And I'll let anyone jump in here who wants to.
I'm happy to start off with this one, if my other panelists don't mind. I think from our perspective, and I've worked in several kind of major events globally, it's to start with, it's multi-jurisdictional. So we are across 3 countries. We are also across 11 US states. So that just naturally adds a level of legal complexity that other major events that I've worked on that are either located in one host city or one country sort of haven't had to deal with. So from our perspective, that's been quite the challenge to sort of navigate that at an operational and regulatory level. And I think secondly, also, it's just the scale of the tournament is absolutely huge. It's, by some measures, the largest global mega event that exists. And that's sort of reflected in the size of the broadcast audience, the size of the footprint, and the size of the audience that'll be attending, and the global reach of the audience that'll be attending as well. So I think all of these are components that we then have to factor into how we're providing legal advice and the sort of strategic guidance that we're providing. And I'll let my other panelists weigh in from there.
I mean, I don't have much to add. I think Emily definitely covered it. I would just say that, I mean, you've got this delicate balance or juggling act, or there's probably some other words people would use, where, you have FIFA, which is kind of this international, they have their own international private governance, and then you're obviously balancing that with the, host cities adapting, and then a lot of this is temporary, right? So you're kind of creating this, we're coming into these host countries and kind of asking them to override some of their legal and regulatory and other enforcement frameworks and kind of align that to some of our contractual or commercial requirements and create this whole kind of new legal ecosystem that's all temporary. And so, just building on just what Emily said, it's all of that, but then it's all of that for just the years that we're here. And so you can imagine that there's obviously this kind of push and pull with some of those frameworks that have obviously been in place years before FIFA arrived in this host country and will go back into place years after FIFA leaves. And so there's just always this kind of delicate negotiation of those varying sort of priorities and stakeholders.
And I would just echo the comments about just the scale and the multi-jurisdictional aspect of the World Cup. And to sort of follow on with what Tiffany was saying, there is extreme temporal compression around this tournament. I mean, I think I've been working on the Seattle bid for about 5 years now. And there's just so much, regulatory issues that you need to go through and infrastructure development, and it all converges on a very fixed timeline. Like we know exactly when the tournament's going to start, and we know exactly when the tournament's going to end, and there is no continuance. We're not moving that, right? And so I think that makes the World Cup just a little bit different, just in terms of the temporal compression around the tournament date. And like Tiffany said, I mean, when the final is done, then sort of it's over. And so I think that makes it a little bit unique as well.
You all sort of alluded to the issue of the timing and how far in advance you start working on these events. So how does FIFA shape the legal and operational expectations for both the host countries and the host cities as they go into that full-on planning phase?
Well, I'll start by just saying that the foundational agreement between FIFA and each of the host cities, and in the US, there's 11 host cities. In Canada, there's two, and in Mexico, there's three. The agreement is called the Host City Agreement. And in Seattle, our mayor, Jenny Durkin, signed the Host City Agreement in 2018. So now here we are in 2026. So that was 8 years ago that the host city agreement was actually signed by our mayor and approved by the city council. And so I would say that's just sort of like the foundational agreement is the host city agreement, and that sets forth all of each of the host cities' obligations and rights and so forth, and everything sort of flows from that host city agreement.
Yeah, I completely agree. And just to take the group through the overall sort of process of how a bid operates is that many years before an event is scheduled, FIFA will release a bid globally. And as part of that bid, they will have hosting documentation that all of the potential bidders have to execute and submit as part of the bid. So a lot of these agreements, as John was sort of alluding to, are signed incredibly far in advance. They're necessarily incredibly high level and without a lot of detail. But they sort of set out in broad strokes FIFA's expectations and operational requirements. Those are obviously going to go through a lot of refinement in the period post-selection. So that is why essentially our entity has been established. So FIFA has actually taken a relatively new approach with this tournament. In previous years, how they've normally structured tournament organizing is through the relevant member association. So in this case, it would be US Soccer. US Soccer would set up its own subsidiary. That subsidiary would be managing delivery on the ground. Starting with Women's World Cup, which was my first tournament with FIFA, FIFA moved to a new model of setting up its own local organizing committee, which is a direct subsidiary on the ground. And the purpose of that sort of local entity is to do exactly that, is to refine and guide these broad-based hosting documents that are jurisdictionally neutral into what that means in practice on the ground. And so we have worked very closely with our amazing host city partners to make sure not only that we have a national lens that's unique to each country, but also a host city lens that meets the requirements from a local perspective as well. So I think that FIFA sets out this broad overarching framework, but then it's our responsibility to kind of work with the stakeholders on the ground to make sure that that reflects the reality on the ground.
And I would just add on the point that Emily made about sort of the local organizing committees. Each of the host cities have spun up local organizing committees. Here in Seattle, I think we have a staff of about 30 now. And we are tasked with working collaboratively with FIFA just to ensure that the tournament is hosted in a manner that is safe and successful and in compliant with all of the obligations under the hosting requirements. And that's repeated throughout the US in all of the host cities.
All right. So then let's do one more sort of 10,000-foot level question before we get into the weeds a little bit. So what are the biggest misconceptions that people have about the legal side of hosting a mega event like the FIFA World Cup?
I could jump in with mine, especially just even before I started here. So I think there's a ton, and I look forward to hearing what John and Emily have to say. But I can say from my end, I think that it's just that it's there's this idea that it's kind of covered by, and I'm going to use the word normal law, just for lack of better words. And I think that is a huge misconception, right? Like even just in how we've kind of answered the last two questions, everything is very bespoke. There's a lot of exemptions. There's a lot of compromises and negotiating on different kind of enforcement mechanisms. So I think that's definitely one misconception. There's a huge misconception that FIFA just runs everything. Maybe that's a misconception internally as well. But I think, externally, I think there's this concept of control, and I'm using quotes because it's just not, right? And so we might have some semblance of control over some of the commercial and sporting elements of things, but there's a lot of shared responsibility across the host cities, across governments, from an infrastructure, immigration, security, safety and security standpoint. And then I would just say, I think the third misconception that a lot of people do have is that a lot of the legal work happens on the front end. And then by tournament time, everyone is just, easy breezy, enjoying themselves and taking selfies with Messi. And no, that's not happening. And so, especially particularly in my area, which I know we'll get into later, but there's just a lot of legal issues that persist throughout the life cycle of the tournament. Just all types of things are happening on match day, in the middle of the night, broken seats, workforce issues, labor and employment, crisis management. And then again, we get into my area, I have an operational legal role where kind of the bulk of my work starts during tournament time. And up until that point, I'm just doing a lot of prep, but all of my execution is during tournament time. So for me, those are kind of like, I think the biggest misconceptions that either I had or I hear from other people. But I look forward to hearing what Emily and John have to say.
No, I completely agree. And I think the biggest misconceptions I kind of both had and have encountered is, first of all, that it's all sports related. As you say, we're just on the field taking selfies with Messi or, hanging out at a match. In reality, a lot of what we do is just heavily transactional. So everyone brush up on that contract law skill set because that is going to be what you're mainly using. I also think it's so much of the operational delivery is less about the actual matches and more about how do we get things from A to B in a safe and secure way. And so there are so many different functional areas that you would never even consider, as sort of Tiffany alluded to, like we have transport, logistics, security. We have our host city management team, which kind of works very closely with John. And so it really is less about the sports than it is about the law. And while you do get the chance to have some very cool moments, I'm not going to say you don't. You do have to be prepared to roll up your sleeves and just get into the transactional side of things as well. So,
Well, first of all, if either of you, Emily or Tiffany, get a selfie with Messi, please text it to me because I need to see that. Okay.
will do, will
Good luck
do.
with that, but if it happens, then please text it to me. I would say, this was sort of alluded to earlier, but one misconception is that FIFA does everything, right? FIFA does everything. No, that's not the case, right? FIFA works in close, collaboration with each of the local organizing committees, with the hosting governments, with the federations. It's a very collaborative, sort of multifaceted relationship. I mean, yes, FIFA is the international governing body of soccer or football, but there are lots of players that are involved in hosting an event of this scale. So I think the first misconception is, oh, it's all FIFA. No, that's not the case, right? They work very closely with a number of other stakeholders. I think a second misconception that maybe I had before I started this is, oh, hosting a tournament like this is just sports and logistics, right? It's just putting on a soccer game and making sure people can get in, the ticketing system works and so forth. No, that is not the case, right? There are labor and employment issues that are presented. There's environmental issues. I've had to learn so much just about like municipal law and administrative law. There's tax issues, immigration, of course. I mean, betting, gaming, liquor, beverage control laws. I mean, there are just a huge number of legal issues, and it's not just sports and logistics, right? It's not at all. So I think that's sort of another misconception. I think the last that I might say is, that people might think that local laws always control, right? Like, oh, if you're hosting games in California, California law applies, or if you're hosting games in Dallas, then, Texas laws. No, that's not the case, right? There's a lot of sort of multi-jurisdictional issues there, just given sort of the nature of the event as um, a global event. And, FIFA is an organization that has a presence in Switzerland and now in the US. And so it's not just always governed by local law, right? There's a lot of sort of multi-jurisdictional issues. So I'd say those are a few of the misconceptions I think people might have.
Great. Well, thank you. Let's move on a little bit to brand protection and some of the IP issues. So just to start with, why is brand protection such a critical priority for the World Cup organizers and sponsors?
I can jump in.
Tiffany, you should take this one.
Yeah.
So, I'll put it very simply put because I know we have a lot of kind of more detailed questions, and so I don't want to give a long answer then and then the whole panel will be over. So I think generally just from a top line standpoint, right? It's there to protect, and I always joke and tell people the definition is in the words, but we're not just protecting the FIFA brand. So, but if we start there, protecting the FIFA brand from a reputational standpoint, right? So our day-to-day in brand protection is everything from giving guidance on what a media network has reached out about a hit piece and how we should kind of work with comms to formulate a response. There are people that protest FIFA and have very strong opinions, and we'll try to kind of get on camera during our matches. And so, again, protecting kind of the FIFA brand. Obviously, the IP portfolio is a huge piece of that. But then there's also the obviously protecting the fans. And so down to match day, protecting the fans from unauthorized affiliations, and more specifically, those unauthorized affiliations like could be fake tickets. That is a reality in our world. And so I always have to remind people that yes, there are fake paper tickets out there. They are back. I know most people who are younger than me probably have not seen a Ticketmaster paper ticket before, but I can assure you that I have seen fake ones. I have them at my desk. And so, but if you can imagine from a fan experience, fans are coming over from another country. They may be used to paper tickets. They may not fully speak English. They're also showing up with cash in hand, which make them prime targets for ticket scalpers, right? So from a brand protection standpoint, we are also on the ground on match day enforcing against that because that's a bad fan experience. And then thirdly, just protecting our sponsors' investments. Our sponsors and partners have written very large checks to kind of be affiliated with this tournament. And so when a non-partner, non-sponsor comes along and tries to affiliate themselves and basically probably spend 1/10 of what our partner and our sponsors spent to do so, that does not obviously do well for us in justifying that sponsor's investment. And it also then does not make that sponsor happy or allow them to want to return for future World Cup tournaments. So there's kind of various buckets, but there's a lot of benefit. And I know that Emily and John can even speak to it from just, how they factor that in probably to the agreements early on and some of the protections from a transactional standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I can say it much better than what Tiffany said. I mean, I was definitely wanted to raise just the idea of protecting the value for the sponsors, right? Because, if FIFA doesn't, vigorously enforce its marks and its brand and allows for ambush marketing, the whole sort of sponsorship model just collapses, right? And so, yes, there's the fan experience element, but from, the context of someone like Visa or Adidas or Coca-Cola or something like that, like they've invested a huge amount of money in this, and if they don't see the value in that, then the whole sort of model just collapses.
Well, this is kind of did you want to jump in, Emily?
No, I was just going to say, I have nothing further to add. Those two are definitely the expert in this
Because
realm.
this is a perfect segue then to our next question. So how are these official sponsorship rights defined and then enforced in practice when you're in the midst of this event, both planning and hosting while it's actually ongoing?
So
I'm happy to sort of answer that one in the first instance, and then I'm sure Tiffany has something to add. So I would say they are defined at a FIFA level kind of years in advance. So many of these agreements are obviously negotiated, years in advance. And so those sponsorship rights will be defined based on FIFA's overall kind of IP and assets and initiatives that it's delivering. And they're defined at kind of a global international level and then operationalized to the extent that needs to be on the ground delivery. Obviously, there's some level of kind of responsiveness in there. The sponsor comes in with a particular sort of initiative that it wants to see a return on investment. FIFA will do its best to deliver, but basically they're defined at a global level, delivered at a local level. And I'll defer to Tiffany on that one.
No, and I think that's exactly right. And then when you think about enforcement, though, right? So I think what Emily outlines is you have it defined at a global level, but then you get into these specific host countries, right? And it becomes, I always kind of do this kind of outside in, right? You have the global level where, okay, this is what we agreed to 10 years ago. And, you get into the host country, and this is how it actually works in practice in Russia, in Qatar. And now we're kind of like, welcome to North America. More specifically, welcome to the United States, where ambush marketing is not on its face illegal, right? And so, but that changes country by country. And obviously, like sometimes it's about managing sponsors' expectations and sometimes delivering a little bit of bad news because, yes, you agree to the kind of these global rights and these global expectations, but now you're in a new country. And in this country, billboards are privatized. And so we can't always control all of the billboards leading to the stadium. And so sorry to tell you, but there may be some non-Coca-Cola brands that buy up all the billboards leading to the stadium in the United States versus previous World Cup locations where that could be controlled. So the enforcement in practice becomes very, very, very much tied and more nuanced based on the country that we're operating in. So when we talk about, again, I'm continuing to use ambush marketing as an example. In the United States, if there's no IP, if they're not using our IP, there's not entirely very much we can do about that, right? And I know we'll talk about a little bit later about clean zones and the importance of that. But without a clean zone, and even sometimes within a clean zone, there's only so much you can do, and there are some restrictions on clean zones because people have obviously been sued in the past over them. And so ambush marketing is tough, and some people are very savvy. There are sometimes I see some ambush marketing, and as I'm so upset, but then I'm also like, well played, well done. Uh,
And Tiffany, can I just jump in real quick?
yeah.
For some of the audience who might not be familiar, can you just
Oh,
give us a very brief primer on ambush marketing and
yes.
maybe some examples that you've come across?
Yes, sorry. So, essentially, ambush marketing is the overall concept is that someone who is a non-sponsor. So let's choose your favorite non-Adidas brand, although everyone's favorite brand should be Adidas on this call. But and let's take a non-Adidas brand, and they will come along and they will wrap every building surrounding the stadium, buy every billboard leading up to the stadium. And basically, what they're trying to present as is they are affiliated or a partner, a sponsor of this event, but they're doing it for 1/10 of the cost. They are actually not an official partner. They are there to be disruptive. They are there to kind of leverage the visibility of the actual tournament and leverage that to boost their visibility. And obviously, and I understand the need, right? Like you have all eyes on this large event. What better way to get, your dollar's worth and your advertising in than to, have those eyes be a little bit distracted and see your brand in the background behind the Jumbotron. And so they will try everything. They will give out free merch at the bar across the street and encourage fans to bring it into the stadium and specifically pay for fans that all sit in the same section to, try to get on TV, and they'll all have on the shirts or some color that's affiliated with a non-Coca-Cola brand. They'll try to do blimps across the top of the stadium. We are grateful because this event is so large that we have some protected airspace. But that protection does not go, is not infinite, right? So you could still try to fly a blimp around a little further out or a little higher up. Again, like I said, there's a big thing about building wraps. and they will wrap buildings, and they will just do anything they can to kind of take advantage of the moment and gain some attention. And this is just on the ground, right? There's so much ambush marketing happening online. We've been seeing that probably for the last 2 years. Everything from people telling you, we're your official hospitality partner, book this package deal, stay at our hotel, you'll get free tickets to the match, and all these other things that we are just constantly playing whack-a-mole trying to shut down. So, very simply put, ambush marketing is a brand's attempt at affiliating themselves and pretend basically an unauthorized affiliation with our event, and they are not an official sponsor.
So, David, I wanted to just circle back on your question about how are sponsorship rights defined. And I think Emily did a nice job of talking about sort of FIFA global sponsors. I think, I don't know how many of our audience members have worked on sponsorship agreements in sports context or entertainment or something like that, but often sponsorship rights are defined by category. And so certain sponsors can get exclusive rights in a specific category. So maybe that's beverage or vehicles or computers or whatever it is. And so they're often paying like a premium because they know that they're going to be the only sponsor in that particular category. And so that's one way that sponsorship rights are sort of defined, is just by category. There's other ways that sponsorship rights can be defined through like designations, the right to use things like official partner of FIFA World Cup or official partner of, Seattle Local Organizing Committee. And so you can define based on sort of designations. And then the last, which I know we're sort of talking around, is just the use of IP, right? FIFA's IP, the World Cup IP, is tremendously valuable. I mean, there's probably not many marks in the world that are more valuable than FIFA's marks. And so sponsorship rights can be defined by the use of specific pieces of IP. And so there's sort of tiers. At the very top, spoiler alert, is the World Cup trophy, right? Like that is the premium sort of IP asset that FIFA holds. And, they're very selective about how the trophy is actually used. But sponsorship rights can be further defined just through the use of certain marks and through the use of certain types of IP.
Yeah. And I know we're probably giving you the longer answers, but I think the other big enforcement piece that is kind of ramping up as well as we get closer is the naming rights of the stadiums. And that's from the outside of the stadium to right. So right now we call all of our stadiums by the city name. So John works with Seattle Stadium. And that takes a lot of practice, right? Especially, but you have to also imagine like how important that is, particularly when some of the stadiums are named after direct competitors of some of our partners and some of our sponsors. And so that becomes important, not just from the external, like actual name on outside the stadium, but down to something as simple as like the name of the Wi-Fi, right? You guys have all been to NFL games and you sign on to that free Wi-Fi, and the Wi-Fi is typically named after the name of the stadium. And so we actually have to execute down to that granular level of changing the name of the Wi-Fi, of going around the stadium and putting tape and putting dressing and signage over suite names and all types of things, and monitor screens that don't say Lenovo. And so if they don't say Lenovo, there's black tape going across that name. And so it's so big picture from the global level where Emily started to down to literally there's a team that's going around putting black tape on names, on brand names within the stadium.
Yeah, and I just wanted to give one example of how these sponsorship rights can kind of play out in the real world and right now. Qatar Airways has a sponsorship arrangement with FIFA, and here in Seattle, we wanted to do a local sponsorship deal with Alaska Airlines. It's a local company, probably pretty familiar with it, and Alaska Airlines has a relationship with Qatar Airways, but also Qatar already has the relationship with FIFA. And so before we could move forward at all with Alaska Airlines, we had to work collaboratively with the FIFA commercial team to say, hey, are we okay here, right? Are we okay engaging in these discussions with Alaska Airlines? Because we know that Qatar Airways has already paid a lot for some exclusivity in that. And thankfully, there is a relationship between Qatar Airways and Alaska Airlines through some type of alliance or something like that. But that was just an example that has just been coming up recently of like, what is exactly Alaska Airlines allowed to do? Can they put some IP on the side of a plane, right? And so we had to work through that with Alaska Airlines, with the FIFA commercial team who were working with Qatar Airways. And I think we got to a good place on it. But that's just kind of a real world example of how these things sort of play out.
Right.
And I
Well,
think that builds on John's point of he mentioned categories earlier, and sometimes those categories also have regional components as well that restrict that, right? Because if you can imagine, if every host city wanted to work with the airline, they could also basically end up all ambushing each other. So,
so we've had a number of questions come in when we were talking about the ambush marketing. And so I think I'll kind of paraphrase them, but one is, what can FIFA and or the host cities do proactively to address ambush marketing? And then two, what can you do to police it sort of during the event while it's ongoing? Because a lot of things you see, lawsuits take place after the fact. What can you actually do while it's going on? So kind of two parts, one proactively, and then two in the moment.
yeah, I can take the policing piece, but I think Emily, they, I don't want to speak for you, but I will because I'm here to hype you up. But I think Emily and the team have done some put in some kind of very savvy language into some of the agreements on the front end that I think help with the first part of your question, David.
Yeah, happy to speak to that really quickly. So obviously we've got protections in all of our hosting documentation, which the host cities are really helping us out with in terms of clean zones, etc. But also we have to ensure we have contractual protections in all of our services agreements. So making sure that we, prohibit people from associating with our brand, and then when that occurs, that we're actively policing it, bringing it down, making sure that those rights are protected and respected and enforced. So I'll defer back to Tiffany and the rest of it.
No, but I say that because I think it's really important, right? So when we can enforce and we can police and all the things, but a lot of times it does come back to what Emily and the team have done on the transactional end, right? So what leverage do we even have? Is this a relationship conversation, or can we actually point to a spot in said agreement to say like, hey, you guys are actually in breach of this, and everyone hates the word breach because again, in a fast-paced tournament, what are we really doing about breach, and how what are we actually going to court? Are we actually litigating? That's a whole nother panel. But I think it is important to just kind of emphasize the language that the team is putting into these agreements because it does help bolster kind of what legal ground we have to stand on when it comes to enforcement. And so I think when it comes to policing it, like I said, on the ground, well, I'll start with a lot of it is online right now, right? And so we have our law firm K&L Gates, John, and Katie and team. They've put together kind of with our FIFA Americas team this online kind of enforcement and reporting tool that's called FIFA Desk, and that is a process by which we've created just for our partners to kind of give them a very fast track, fast paced approach to be able to say, hey, we've seen this, we need this actioned against, we need C&D letters immediately, and things like that. But before we even get to that, the team has sent out pre cease and desist letters to some of these brands to just say, hey, we're here. We know that you're a competitor of said sponsor. We know that you have ambushed in the past. Do not do this. Here are the parameters. Here are the outlines. Here's what you can and cannot do. So then by the actual offense, now this is your second slap on the hand, right? And so they have that approach online. We're also working with a company, an enforcement company online called Core Search that is literally using AI tools and other proprietary tools to kind of always be scraping online to find any use of our IP. How can we enforce that through said platforms, terms and conditions? We haven't even touched on counterfeit, but we'll stick to ambush right now. And just kind of what can we do about that? And then the third thing is when we get to on the ground. So when we're on the ground and we're seeing it, we are working in advance. That same host city agreement that Emily worked on is we're saying, hey, host city, you guys agreed with us to work with your city offices to prevent said permit. I talked to you guys earlier about wrapping a building and how a competitor will try to wrap a building to ambush the event. Well, what do you need to wrap a building? In order to wrap a building, you probably need a city permit. You probably, there's a lot of steps you had to go through to get permission to do that. Now, there are some brands that are just going to wing it. They're just going to do it live. And they may not have a legal team. They've ignored their legal team. They don't care. They're just going to risk getting sued. And those are the ones that we're actually a little bit more concerned about. But there's other large brands that have very intelligent legal teams, very savvy legal teams who have said to them, here's the line, here's how close you can get to the line. And so we are kind of collaborating with our host city in advance to say, we know these things are coming. We've walked your stadium. My team has probably been to every stadium at least 2 to 3 times, walked on foot what the 1 mile perimeter is around that stadium, and have highlighted if I were to ambush, these are all the places I would ambush. This is the building I would wrap. This is the billboard I would buy. This is the corner I would hand something out on because of the fan flow. This is where the last mile is. Perfect. That's the bus that I would wrap if I were to ambush. And then we go to the host city and say, what are we doing to prevent these things? If such and such, if non-Visa brand wants to come and wrap that bus, buy that billboard, wrap this building, and hand out free banners on this corner, what permits and what process would they have to go through, and then how do we block it? And so that's kind of what we're doing in advance. And then on match day in advance, we have a clean zone in most of our cities. And that clean zone allows us to kind of have what I like to call an invisible fence. Half of most of you guys on this call are probably too young to know of a movie called Jurassic Park, but it's one of my favorite movies. So I use the analogy. Um, and it's basically this, imagine a clean zone is like this invisible fence, and the competitors are like, the Raptors that are trying to test weaknesses in the fence, right? So on the ground on match day, I have a two-person team. They are working with law enforcement, and they have 20 to 30 volunteers who are all out patrolling from the last mile to the security gate entrance where your ticket gets scanned. And they are reporting and enforcing. They are the eyes and ears. And if we see somebody ambushing, selling tickets, or trying to get rid of counterfeit merchandise, we are sending law enforcement to push them outside of our clean zone perimeter. So that is kind of a very long answer, but that is kind of how, and I know we probably skipped over multiple examples, but that's how it kind of goes from contracting to working with the host city to then execution on match day.
And I would say from the host city's perspective, the way that that's sort of playing out in practice is, like Tiffany said, we have a team of, I think, 30 law students. Shout out all the law students on this webinar, and they are going to be our brand protection team, and they're going to literally be out on match day, and they're all going to have, I think, like a WhatsApp group chat or something like that, and they're going to be just policing, right? And so that's the enforcement side of things. On the proactive sort of diligence side of things, we've done a ton of work just to do an audit of all of the available like billboard space within the clean zone. We've done exhaustive research on all of the sort of local permits and sign codes and things like that, just trying to understand like what are the requirements. And we've worked really closely with the city government just to ensure that there is some notice and enforcement around these type of permits, because like Tiffany said, no one can just go and slap a huge sign up on the side of a building, right? There's a process that has to go through. And so we've tried to do a ton of proactive work on the front end just to understand what all those requirements are and how we can have some input in those type of like applications. And I'm really excited that we have this team of law students that are going to be out there on match day, working with our local organizing committee, working with FIFA just to ensure that we can meet the brand protection standards.
And I would just add one more thing is I think the last line of defense is sometimes, being a good lawyer and being a good collaborator is also delivering some bad news, right? And so sometimes you have to manage expectations. So sometimes the answer is we actually cannot control that. And so then sometimes that means that I am going to Visa, Coca-Cola, and Adidas and saying, This parking lot across the street, I'm particularly thinking of one stadium. I literally have it in my mind. There's one parking lot across the street that is privately owned and historically rents out their parking lot to brands to build activations. We cannot control this. And so one of the contractual elements within our host city agreements is called the BAU, business as usual principle. And what that means is it's actually a carve out. So we can have the perfect clean zone. Perfect, rock solid. You can't do anything. However, any businesses that fall within that clean zone perimeter, if their ordinary course of business is to have a, let's say a Nike pop-up or a Pepsi activation, if they are a Pepsi restaurant and that is their normal course of business, unfortunately, they can still do that, right? And we know that Nike and Pepsi is going to take full advantage of that. And so there is Boston Stadium has a parking lot across the street that is privately owned and they always sell it to someone who wants to activate. So then if I can't control that, then I go to Visa, Coca-Cola, Adidas, and I say, I would advise you, here's his phone number. I would advise you to reach out and rent that parking lot first. And sometimes that is what managing expectations looks like.
Right. Well, so we have about 20 minutes left. So let's move a little bit from IP into some of the host country and city legal and operational challenges. So what are the key legal responsibilities of a host city when preparing for the World Cup? And what are the biggest legal considerations in infrastructure development for hosting the event?
I'll defer to John on the first one.
Well, I mean, the host city agreement, like Emily said, spells out the hosting requirements at a very high level, and then FIFA follows up with that with a very, very detailed set of hosting requirements, and it is a very voluminous set of requirements that gets down pretty granular. At a very high level or macro level, the host city is required to host a safe and secure tournament, right? And so one of our key considerations is safety and security. We hired at the organizing committee a former Seattle police chief, and he's been leading our security team. And that's been honestly like one of our paramount concerns, right? Beyond that, there's obviously requirements related to the stadium. Now, there's a separate agreement that we haven't really mentioned called the stadium agreement. That's not with the local organizing committee, that's with the stadium operator. And so each of the host cities might have a separate stadium operator. And so they enter into a specific contract with FIFA for the use of the building itself, for the use of the stadium. And so that has, separate sort of requirements there. So I think at the local organizing committee level, I mean, fundamentally, we have an obligation to handle transportation, to handle safety and security, and fan zones. That we haven't even really talked about fan zones, but that's a huge part of the fan experience, right? Where people are going to gather and experience just the magic of the World Cup. So we have an obligation to, put those fan zones, fan celebrations on throughout the host city.
I would just add to that the legal considerations around sort of infrastructure development. We obviously partner with our host cities to make sure that we have sufficient infrastructure to manage people from point A to point B safely and securely, and make sure that we are operating the tournament in the safest way possible. And then the other consideration, obviously, is ensuring compliance with the laws of the game. Obviously, not as serious, but very, very serious to FIFA. So making sure that obviously, the pitch is the right size, that we're meeting all of our legal obligations to our partners, and that we're making sure that we are running the event as needed to ensure that we are delivering everything we need to all our stakeholders.
One other thing I'll just briefly mention, because it might be interesting to some people listening, but there's this concept of team base camps that we haven't really talked about. And, each of the teams who have qualified to compete in the World Cup will come to the US, Mexico, or Canada several weeks before the tournament just to acclimate and start getting ready. And often these are at a university or at a facility that's owned by another soccer team, an MLS team, or something like that. And they'll essentially take it over and they'll just make that their base camp and they'll go from there to whatever venue they're playing in. And so the local organizing committee also has an obligation to work with FIFA to sort of, partner with an MLS team or a university to help identify base camps because there's, obviously minimum requirements that are needed. And then each of the qualifying countries there's a process whereby they can, you know, enter their preferences for base camps, and then ultimately they're, selected for a certain base camp, whether that's in the US, Mexico, or Canada. So that's another element of the local organizing committee's obligation to work with FIFA for these team base camps.
So kind of moving along this path with the local involvement, how does FIFA and or the city, how do they coordinate with the states, the provinces, or the national government when some of these issues come up that are beyond just maybe purely local issues?
Yeah, so I'm happy to kind of respond to that. Probably the main area we see this coming up is in the security space. Our role as FIFA is sort of to centralize planning, to come up with overall guidance across the tournament footprint, but also to coordinate between all of those different levels that you referenced just there. So it's obviously a crowded stakeholder environment. We have local government, we have the city. We have state, we have federal and agencies that we need to incorporate as well. And so FIFA's role is really to centralize planning, ensure alignment, ensure clear roles and responsibilities, and to make sure that there's efficient communication across all of those groups. So we've established sort of working groups for each host city that incorporate representatives of each of those different stakeholder groups. And basically they meet regularly, make sure that we're sharing communications, sharing planning, and on track to deliver everything we need for the tournament. So yeah.
And another interesting point is that FIFA has staff on the ground in each of the host cities. And so they've, hired folks and gotten them office space, and they're literally on the ground right now in each of the host cities. So they have a presence. Emily and Tiffany are joining us today from Miami, but there are FIFA folks in all of the host cities currently. And from the organizing committee's perspective, we sort of serve as a conduit, right? So if the City of Seattle, attorney's office has an issue with something related to the World Cup, then they'll come to the organizing committee and say, "Hey, we've got this issue," whatever it might be, and then we will then go to Emily or Curtis or anybody else in the FIFA legal team and say, "Hey, this issue just came up," and sort of we serve as sort of a conduit between like the local government and FIFA.
All right, so along that line of local related issues, what kind of regulatory hurdles commonly arise in this area? Permitting, zoning, licensing, and especially things if you can think of maybe where the average fan wouldn't even be aware of or thinking about this kind of issue.
Yeah, so I think for us, something that has been a big focus of ours over the past few months, particularly, is the sort of concept of special event licenses. And for an event of this scale, a lot of the local municipalities will kind of want enhanced visibility of certain components of the event to make sure that it's being delivered in a way that kind of meets their needs and doesn't threaten their local infrastructure. So we will be often working through our host committees and in partnership with them to apply for these special event permits, make sure they have all the information they need, make sure that we're getting this all well in advance, because those will often be linked to building permits. So in some states, you cannot even start to build without these special event permits. So it becomes a real timing issue of we're starting to kind of bump in at certain stadiums now. So I would say that's probably a nuance that's maybe not always appreciated, and we very much appreciate the partnership with our local host committees on that one.
So Emily, I don't want to put you on the spot, but talking about the issues sort of that can arise in local law, do you want to like briefly just talk about what happened in Qatar with the serving of alcohol and like how that all played? Yeah, I thought I might get that reaction out of you.
Yeah, look, love being put on the spot. No, yeah, it's a great example of what can happen in other jurisdictions. So essentially, very shortly before the 2022 World Cup kicked off, the Qatari government determined that it was not comfortable with alcohol being served at stadiums. despite sort of, all of the planning to date having been clearly around, alcohol being able to be served, which, to be fair, had been a significant deviation from previous, practice, and was a big exception from a very religiously focused country. So we had known this was an exception. We had thought it would be granted, but then obviously at the higher levels they decided they weren't comfortable with that very short order. So obviously this is the type of crisis issue that arises that you have to be agile and respond to. We're obviously always going to deliver an event in accordance with applicable laws. If it's determined that that's an applicable law, then we are going to have to change our planning accordingly. And it really is just about making sure that we have, first of all, the flexibility in our contracts to be able to respond to those type of restrictions, but also that we have strong relations with our partners so that they understand that, when these restrictions come into play, it's a long-term relationship. It's not, these relationships, can last over decades. So there's not always going to be, there's going to be a future opportunity to kind of have a make good, to work out, any shortfalls in any particular event. So, so I think having strong relationships with partners, having contingencies and agreements to make sure that, alternatives are worked through, but also making sure that, you're able to have the resourcing to be able to pivot and sell like the non-alcoholic version, which is what we ended up doing. And we actually had a very positive sort of uptake in the fan festival, which was allowed to have alcohol served as an alternative. But yes, all the nuances of delivering in different contexts.
All right. So obviously with an event like this, safety and security is sort of at the top of the priority list. So what are the major sort of public safety and security obligations that you're considering, and how are they typically allocated? Who is in charge of what? How is that decided as you're moving forward with hosting this event?
I'm happy to launch.
Yeah. Go ahead, Emily, and I can just
No,
chime
Emily,
in.
this is your world. Let's go.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, I don't know. That's how I want to be known. Sorry, the question was what are the public security sort of concerns that we have to be working through? So again, as I mentioned before, it's a crowded landscape. From a public safety standpoint, around the event, particularly in relation to the last mile, that normally falls within the remit of the host city and the host committee in this instance. So they are kind of managing and marshalling the local police forces and other security resources, public safety resources in and around the stadium. FIFA sort of, again, manages the overall regulation and guidance for how the standards that need to be delivered, but that has to obviously be in compliance and partnership with local law enforcement who are going to have their own requirements. So we kind of work in lockstep with them. FIFA's remit from a direct contracting standpoint is more private security. So we'll deal with the private security within the stadium, in and around the stadium. We'll also deal with emergency management services. So in the event that there's a crisis, we will be responsible for managing the kind of first response for our constituent groups. And then obviously, again, liaising with federal and state law enforcement agencies on information sharing. If there are any specific risk factors or any specific threats to a match, that will obviously be coordinated at a FIFA level, but there'll be strong partnership with all of the relevant stakeholders to make sure those risks can be addressed.
I mean, like I said earlier, safety and security is sort of the primary concern for the host committee, for the local organizing committee, for all of them, right? I mean, there's no event that has more high visibility than the World Cup. There will be heads of state attending these games. There will be, A-list celebrities, and so it's a very there's a lot of risk there, right? And I think the way Emily put it is great, where there's sort of concentric circles of responsibility, right? Where FIFA is responsible for the security within the stadium, then the host committee has responsibility for security within sort of the restricted perimeter, right? Like the clean zone and so forth. And then outside of that, there's going to be, hundreds of thousands of fans. Then the host committee has to work with the local police force just to ensure that all the fans who are attending have a safe and secure experience when they're coming to the US, Mexico, or Canada for this. So it's a very collaborative effort. But like I said, it's honestly the top consideration. And I will say this, say what you want about sort of the, you know, current administration in the United States, but they have provided some federal funding. And so each of the host committees have been able to apply for funding from the federal government to help pay for safety and security costs. And obviously that's been helpful because these providing a safe and secure tournament is expensive. It's costly, right? And so the federal government in the U.S., I'm only speaking about the U.S., has provided some federal funding for each of the host cities for safety and security costs, including something that I've learned a lot about, drone mitigation. I didn't, really know that there's this whole thing about drone mitigation. And certainly, with 50, 60, 70,000 people in a stadium, drones can present risk. And so each of the host cities are sort of implementing, drone mitigation programs.
And I can say in my world, all the safety and security procedures just make my life easier. So I mean, honestly, I am like, great. Like we're, drone mitigation, we're controlling airspace. That means there won't be any blimps flying over trying to ambush so everything I'm like, this is great. We have a security perimeter that some of the stadiums will have a double security perimeter. And so that means that no ticketed fan can get past that security perimeter into the fan zone with anything that's a prohibited item, right? So that means I don't have to worry about a ticket scalper or a counterfeit seller with a duffel bag of jerseys make it into my stadium. Thank you, safety and security. And so just all of those kind of things just kind of make my world obviously a little bit easier. And then we partner with the security team hand in hand on flags and banners control. So a lot of people don't realize this, but in the world of soccer or football, whatever we'd like to call it, there is a huge fan contingent of they're called supporters, and they bring those huge banners that roll out across the entire section. That is actually owned by our security team. And it's owned in conjunction with security, brand protection, and human rights. And we have an entire system in place to make sure that those flags and banners are not only approved but translated, but then they also don't say anything politically offensive, religiously offensive, or anything against, anti-FIFA. And so, or anything that would just start a security incident within the stadium. So even as John mentioned in this current political climate, right, you do have those judgment calls that need to be made from a security standpoint. Can someone, wear a MAGA hat but not a MAGA shirt, but not bring it, but maybe bring a MAGA banner? Like, where are we drawing that line? And not because of any political stance on FIFA's end, but will that cause a riot in the stadium at this particular match? And how do we keep that match safe? And so from brand protection, again, I love that for my world because there will also be um, name any particular beer brand that is trying to kind of get visibility in the stadium and handing flags and banners out to fans in the same colors of that fan's favorite team and basically trying to get this fan to inadvertently ambush. That also falls under security's flags and banners procedures, and they will also be kind of blocking those from coming in as well. So again, thank you to safety and security because they constantly kind of add a double layer to some of the things that I'm trying to work on. And obviously, brand protection falls a lot lower on the safety scale of priorities, but I benefit from a lot of their controls.
Well, I think we're pretty much out of time right now. I don't want to disparage any of my former previous webinar participants or friends, but this might be the most fun webinar I've ever been a part of. I could keep talking for hours with you all. So I want to give a big thanks to Emily Jackson, Tiffany Shepard, and John Wilson for sharing their expertise on what it takes to put on one of the biggest sporting events on the planet and what really goes on behind the scenes when hosting the World Cup. We are all looking forward to watching it this summer, and we thank you everyone for tuning in. For those of you seeking CLE credit, you will receive an email after the event requesting your bar number so that we can report your attendance to the Oregon State Bar. And then we also hope you will save the date and join us on June 5th for our next Oregon Law Perspectives webinar, The Cost of Music: Has Digitization Made Copyright Obsolete? A look into the democratization of the music industry and the justification for sound recording copyrights. And on August 5th for the Federal Tribal Relationship in Practice, Trust Responsibilities and Current Indian Law Developments, featuring two of our distinguished Indian law faculty speaking on important and timely issues impacting law and society today. Visit the Oregon Law Perspectives page on the Oregon Law website for more information and registration details. Lastly, if you are a law student interested in pursuing a career in sports law, we invite you to master your game with two 3-credit courses this summer at Oregon Summer Sports Law Institute. Both professional sports law and pathway to practice will be offered, where you can score major insights on some of the most urgent, complex, and fascinating legal questions at play from some of the nation's top sports law professors, as well as guest speakers from the professional sports industry, the media, and more. And last but not least, look soon for our new sports law LLM that will build on Oregon Law's business law LLM in a program that combines specialized sports law coursework with the business law expertise modern sports practice demands. The sports law LLM is designed for attorneys and law graduates, both domestic and international, who see sport as a complex legal arena where your expertise can make a real impact. You can find more information on the Oregon Summer Sports Law Institute and the new LLM on the Oregon Law website. Enjoy the rest of your Friday. Thanks again for attending, and thank you again to our panelists. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks for
Thank you.
having us.
Thank you, David.
Bye.
Bye.